He pressed his forehead against mine, clasped me round the waist, and said that henceforth we were married. Did Queequeg and Ishmael really get married? Is Moby Dick a love story between two men? Herman Melville's 1851 classic novel is often cited as an early example of a gay novel, but the claim doesn't have universal agreement. Critics state that such a claim lacks evidence and are taking Melville out of context. Those critics might also want me to finish the aforementioned quote. Henceforth, we were married, meaning in his country's phrase that we were bosom friends. He would gladly die for me if need should be. So are Queequeg and Ishmael bosom friends or bosom friends of Dorothy? Let's investigate. Moby Dick, romance or bromance? Ishmael and Queequeg meet in chapter 3 and have to share a bed. There are not enough rooms for Ishmael to rent a private room at the hotel, and it was not uncommon for hotel guests of the same sex to share a bed at the time of writing, and Melville henceforth refers to the pair as bedfellows. Bedfellows is an interesting term that for me captures the essence of the queer debate in Moby Dick. Bedfellows literally means people who share a bed, and it's very accurate, but it's a very literal interpretation. Bedfellows carries with it an idea of intimacy, of friendship with it. It has similar but subtly different meanings to words such as best friend or roommate. This of course also applies to Ishmael and Queequeg. The phrase strange bedfellows was in use since at least 1616 when it was used in the play Two Angry Women of Abington. Bedfellows carries with it that feeling of weirdness, an unlikely friendship or alliance, and what better way to describe the relationship between the pair? But bedfellows was sometimes used to mean concubine. So often we see in Moby Dick an explanation that makes so much sense without a queer interpretation. But then we also have this queer interpretation that works, and that in no way invalidates the other interpretation. Most queer quotes from Moby Dick take place in chapter 10. It's where the marriage quote comes from, and I want to explore a few other quotes just to add a bit of context. Consider how open-minded Ishmael is to first allow Queequeg as his roommate, then to strike up a conversation with him, then to smoke with him, then to allow himself to be married to him, then to agree to die for him, then to continue the bedfellow relationship. This is an open-minded sailor, this Ishmael. Queequeg is a Polynesian, and I don't think it's disputed that Melville is talking about cultural differences. It's very easy to read that quote as a commentary on racism or just accepting people who are different. But that doesn't exclude it from being about gay people. In literature, unlike science, we need to be very sparing of our use of Occam's razor. The word married also appears in inverted commas, which could equally be a demonstration of irony or emphasis. Both were common uses of inverted commas in Melville's time. Later in the scene, Queequeg gets out a wooden idol and asks Ishmael to join him in prayer. How then could I unite with this wild idolator in worshipping his piece of wood? But what is worship, thought I? Do you suppose now, Ishmael, that the magnanimous God of heaven and earth, pagans and all included, can possibly be jealous of an insignificant bit of black wood? Impossible. I don't think there's many men that would like to have their romantic attachment to consider their bit of wood insignificant. If we look at those last two quotes as gay, we can see a clear connection to the idea of acceptance. Melville could be arguing that it's okay to be gay and to be making a comparison to the prejudices that existed against other creeds. Melville then finishes the chapter as so. How is it, I know not, but there is no place like a bed for confidential disclosures between friends. Man and wife, they say, there open the very bottom of their souls to each other, and some old couples often lie and chat over old times till nearly morning. Thus, then, in our heart's honeymoon lay I and Queequeg, a cosy, loving pair. If you want to read Moby Dick as gay, the symbolism is clear and also hilarious. If you want to read Moby Dick as straight, it's easy to do so as well. I think it's not controversial to point out right now that if Melville is depicting a gay relationship, that he is depicting it in a positive light. Moby Dick is a massive book coming in at over 800 pages, and there are plenty of examples that can be read as homoerotic if the reader is so inclined. I can't help but to think there is something symbolic about Queequeg being a harpoonist. Melville uses sperm or spermaceti 271 times. That is more than he uses Queequeg, Ishmael, Starbuck, or the Pequod. Stubb stoutly stood up to his spermaceti supper at the capstan head. When Melville says something homoerotic, it is intentionally nudge nudge, wink wink, say no more about it. Why is he using this style of humour? Well, I can think of two obvious conclusions. Firstly, that this is just Melville's sense of humour, or that he is using humour to disguise a gay romance. And I don't think that these two conclusions are exclusive of each other. It's definitely Melville's sense of humour. I also think that it's worth noting that this example of sexual innuendo is outside of Ishmael and Queequeg's relationship. And like a lot of evidence at this point, I think it weirdly strengthens both the argument that Moby Dick is gay and the argument that Moby Dick is not gay. It is tempting to ask then, if they're gay, why didn't Melville just say so? Melville could hardly come out and write a steaming sex scene between Ishmael and Queequeg. He was writing under anti-sodomy laws that punished sodomites with jail, fines, exile, and even death. And that's not to consider the social ostracism he would have faced. It would be very likely that he could wave his writing career bye-bye. Let's explore the argument that Melville is including a hint of queer love, that he's intentionally being subtle, that he is queer coding. I think we need to do a comparative analysis of some other books with LGBT relationships published 4 years after Moby Dick. The Count of Monte Cristo is not often discussed as a gay novel, but it does include a lesbian romance. It is very much a blink and you'll miss it romance. We could be having the same discussion about Dumas' work as we are about Melville's work, but Dumas does remove the doubt. Girls of her character often have a penchant for Sappho's breast. There are people who will argue that the two women are not lovers, that it takes away from a feminist interpretation of the incident, but I think Dumas is pretty explicit. Dumas was writing in France. He was living in a more liberal-minded country, and he was following the example of other famous French authors such as Henri de Balzac or Georges Sand. While French literature is full of examples of LGBT characters, in the US it is radio silence. It is very hard to find another example. Published almost 20 years after Moby Dick, Little Women is often cited as a queer novel. Specifically, Jo March is cited as a queer character. This is despite her marriage to a man. Jo speaks disdainfully about her disappointment in being born a woman. Was Jo trans or a tomboy? There is a theory that she is Louisa May Alcott in the novel, and that Louisa May Alcott, or Louis as they preferred to be known as, was a trans man. The discussion around Little Women and Alcott is really complex and well beyond the scope of this video. But I think it says a lot about the desires of authors at the time to hide their queerness. If I have to literally wait 2 decades and cross the border into Canada to find another possible example of queer literature. I also think that this is a great chance to look at our own biases. I suspect there are very few readers out there that would argue that Little Women is queer, but that Moby Dick was straight, or vice versa. A book written in a similar environment but unquestionably gay is The Picture of Dorian Gray. I know it was published 40 years later and on a different continent, but there's no doubt Wilde was writing at a time of intolerance towards gay men. One only needs to look at his trial. And there is no doubt that Dorian Gray is a gay novel. So let's pick a quote and compare. "It is quite true that I have worshipped you with far more romance of feeling than a man usually gives to a friend. Somehow, I have never loved a woman. Is Basil's declaration of love to Dorian more obvious than Queequeg's declaration of marriage to Ishmael? Both quotes are far from normal, even for the romantic standards of the time. Both quotes stand out, and I think that both quotes are comparable. But it's not that simple. Dorian Gray simply has far more quotes that could be read as gay, while half of Moby Dick's examples are limited to one chapter. While Ishmael and Queequeg end up as a cozy, loving pair, Basil tells Dorian, "I quite admit that I adore you madly, extravagantly, absurdly." There is definitely something lacking in passion for Queequeg and Ishmael in comparison to Dorian and Basil. The Victorians knew what Wilde was writing about. One early critic of Dorian Gray called it a poisonous book and went on to say that it was for outlaw noblemen and perverted telegraph boys, a clear reference to male prostitution. So can we read the obvious LGBT nature of Wilde's book as his recklessness or his desire to get caught? Was Melville more reserved homoerotic nature designed to keep him under the radar, or is Melville under the radar because his characters are just not gay? Let's have a look at the counter argument. This is a modern interpretation of a book that is 170 years old. To say that this is a modern interpretation would be to assume that gay people didn't exist at the time Melville was writing, or if they did exist, that they wouldn't have included their experience in a book. Gay people have obviously existed at all points of history. Humankind just didn't get to the 70s and say, yay, rainbows, unicorns and drag queens. If there are queer people alive today, there were queer people alive in the 1850s. It is natural for people to seek identity or that feeling of being seen from art. One can really see that through Oscar Wilde and Dorian Gray. I would like to point out that just because the modern interpretation argument is flawed, it doesn't necessarily mean the conclusion is wrong. There is actually something really interesting that falls out of this. If Melville is writing his art to be seen, well, that assumes that he's gay. So was he gay? You may do what you please, say or not what you please. And if you feel any inclination for that sort of thing, you may spend the period of your visit in bed, if you like, every hour of your visit. This is an excerpt from one of Melville's letters to his fellow author Nathaniel Hawthorne. Melville places emphasis on the word in bed. In the same letter, Melville adds, by the way, should Mrs. Hawthorne for any reason conclude that she, for one, cannot stay overnight with us, then you must. Again, Melville is emphasizing, this time on the words she and you. Melville also publicly wrote this in a review of one of Hawthorne's books. I have just returned from the haymow, charged more and more with love and admiration of Hawthorne. I feel that this Hawthorne has dropped germinous seed into my soul. He expands and deepens down the more I contemplate him, and further shoots his strong New England roots into the hot soil of my southern soul. The affection was not just one way. We have more writings from Melville available because Hawthorne saved his correspondence while Melville destroyed it. But in the Blithedale romance, Hawthorne includes a character called Hollingsworth, who has a similar appearance to Melville. Hollingsworth asks the protagonist to run away with him, which the protagonist rejects with absolute torture of soul. Was this Hawthorne's acknowledgement of a relationship or a spurned relationship with Melville? Or was Melville merely the inspiration for the character's appearance? Critics of this relationship will point out that both men were married, but so too was Oscar Wilde. Being married at a time of intolerance doesn't prove anything. In Melville's first novel, after he was married, Mardy, he equates suicide and marriage. Melville was born in 1819, and in 1839 he took to the sea, and he didn't return home until 1844. Travelling only in the company of men, Melville worked on board 3 ships before joining the US Navy. If there was no rotation of men at ports, which there likely would have been, he would have worked with over 500 different sailors, all of whom were men. But not all of these men would have been from the same cultures. Considering the long stretches at sea and the sheer number of men, it does seem likely that Melville would have come into contact with some gay men. It seems likely Melville would have seen a gay relationship. Maybe the question should be not, was Melville gay, but was Melville depicting the gay relationships he would have undoubtedly seen? In 1842, Melville deserted and found himself in French Polynesia. He would spend time working here as a beachcomber, and this clearly influenced his work. It's clearly where the inspiration for Queequeg came from. There are many traditional Polynesian words that in Melville's time didn't have an equivalent in English. Mahu refers to transgendered women. Akani translates as friendly man, but is more accurately what we might call a masculine homosexual man. There is also the word fa'afani, which means like a woman. Bisexuality was common among the Polynesians. Many of the chiefs would keep both male and female sexual partners openly. In comparison, at the time in US society, the word gay had a completely different meaning. The first use of the words homosexual and invert in medical journals wouldn't be for another 20 to 30 years. And the terms in use to describe homosexual relationships were all loaded: sodomy, buggery, unnatural vice. While the US condemned queerness, French Polynesia celebrated it. Imagine Melville coming from this super conservative society, living in a society where men lived together openly as lovers, where chiefs were openly bisexual. If Melville was queer, I can certainly see this being a liberating and joyful experience for him. If Melville was straight, then maybe he found it curious or confronting. Either way, what an interesting thing to write about. And write about it Melville did. His time in Polynesia serves as the inspiration for his first novel Taipei and its sequel Omu, both novels being based in Polynesia and depicting the lives of locals. Both these novels having homoerotic themes and bosom friendships between Polynesians and white men. Not unlike Moby Dick. And once may be a coincidence, but 3 times? There is something else about Polynesian culture that is really interesting. Nose touching. It is tradition when you get married to nose touch as part of the ceremony, an act that involves pressing foreheads and noses together. He pressed his forehead against mine, clasped me round the waist, and said, henceforth we were married. It is interesting that Melville includes an accurate description of a Polynesian wedding ceremony. How much queerer would this scene have been if instead of pressing foreheads, they exchanged rings? Polynesian wedding ceremonies also included the exchange of gifts, which could be money, prayer or worship, the exchange of vows, and dancing. All these things happened in the marriage scene between Ishmael and Queequeg. This would only stand out to anybody who had visited Polynesia for an extended period of time. It was hardly likely to cause a stir in US culture. It would be passed off as ridiculous and comical. But then, for those in the know, it's there. It's queer-coded. The argument against Moby Dick being gay is often that there isn't enough evidence, that it isn't compelling or conclusive. I would say it's certainly not the most clear-cut of cases, but the lack of evidence is almost certainly due to the homophobic culture in which Melville was writing. Melville masks all his homosexual acts and love scenes in humour, in layers of interpretation. He has deniability, but he does assume a Western-centric readership. There are a variety of interpretations out there that we can consider and discuss if we allow for the possibility of Moby Dick being gay. I've literally not mentioned anything about Captain Ahab in this video. By engaging with the possibility that Moby Dick is queer, we have a richer and more interesting conversation. I tried to speak, but my tongue was tangled. Queequeg hugged me tight. I hugged him back. The intimacy between me and Queequeg was not the result of an accident or a casual acquaintancy. No, it was the work of a higher power who brought us together for a special purpose. In the bed, we were close. Yes, so close that I put my arm around him and he hugged me tight. He was my rock, my support, my refuge. I could tell we had a deep bond, a bond that went beyond words. I cannot imagine my life without Queequeg.